Yeah, obviously you've been very busy down there, not the least of which includes your call for an audit of the Pentagon. Defense has been a big issue with you. Now, we talk about auditing the Pentagon. Are we talking about the $400 toilet seat and the hammers and that kind of thing? Or are we talking about across the board?
We're talking about across the board. It's been nearly 2 decades, actually, that Congress has called on the Pentagon to be in a position to complete a full audit. Other agencies in government are able to audit their books. We've had a huge issue with that with the Department of Defense, and I want to make sure that we make good decisions for our national security and that we don't waste taxpayer dollars. So I introduced an amendment to the defense authorization to actually make sure that we speed up the audit to the first major step in making sure we have a complete audit by September of 2014. Secretary Panetta, to his credit, said we should make sure we meet that date, so I want to make sure it's in law so it happens this time. We've been waiting too long, and we need accountability for taxpayer dollars there and in every agency in government. And it got passed unanimously, Josh, so I feel good. I think it's going to be included in the final defense authorization package.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question, actually. I mean, did you find it to be a delicate subject to broach when you say the word audit? And when it comes to defense, everybody's saying, our defense spending, and we're talking about weakening here. I mean, was that an issue where people were politically a little bit nervous about getting involved with?
I think we're in a position right now where people realize that we're asking the Department of Defense to make some tough choices. With the Budget Control Act, the Department of Defense is going to have to reduce spending over the next 10 years between $400 and $450 billion. With the super committee failing to come out with a result, there could be additional sequestration and reductions in defense spending. So if they don't have good data on where the money's being spent, and so we can make good decisions so we don't undermine our national security. So there seemed to be consensus from both sides of the aisle that this made a lot of sense, and I give Secretary Panetta credit for actually championing this as well.
Let's talk about national security, and really it's global security. Last week we had a U.S. drone go down within the borders of Iran. Obviously it seems that the U.S. is stepping up their surveillance there. In your mind and your position on the Armed Services Committee, is there any doubt in your mind that Iran is trying to build a nuclear weapon?
Unfortunately, no. And this is one of the greatest national security threats to our country. So I appreciate that we, of course, want to make sure that we get good surveillance information to know what is happening in Iran. This is a grave threat to the entire Middle East, including our close ally, Israel. And there was an amendment that passed to the Defense Authorization Bill that would impose crippling sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran. I'm hopeful that that is going to go forward in the defense authorization, because if we do that, we need to do every step we can short of military action, and of course military action has to be an option. We cannot allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon, but we owe it to ourselves and the world to make sure that we pursue economic sanctions vigorously now.
Talk about the situation down in, gridlock's obviously a key word in this presidential campaign. And perhaps there was a snapshot of this last week when the president nominated Richard Cordray, former Attorney General of Ohio, to head up the Consumer Protection Bureau. And it was blocked by Republicans. And some Democrats say, see, that's perfect. There's no sense to that. It's almost like because the president proposed it, we're going to defeat it.
Let me tell you about this position. What Republicans want is accountability for, it's not about Richard Cordray or any other nominee, but greater accountability for this position. This Consumer Bureau actually has no accountability to Congress for its appropriations. It can get its appropriations from the Federal Reserve and never has to come back to Congress for any approval. It has unilateral rulemaking authority, and there are grave consequences to lack of accountability. And I'm not going to support any more czars in Washington.
Well, is it a lack of qualifications on the part of...
No, it really wasn't about Richard Cordray. He served as an attorney general, so it wasn't about his qualifications. It's about, we want to work with the administration to make sure that there's more accountability for that agency. Look what happened with the Federal Reserve recently. We found out revelations that the Federal Reserve had actually given further bank bailouts than the American public knew. And so I think we need within our government accountability, transparency for these agencies, and this is one that essentially creates another czar. So we want to work with the administration and make sure that that accountability is there.
Payroll tax obviously is another issue. Where does that stand right now? Because for the viewer at home and the layman, they look at this and say, this is a no-brainer, where if they can't find common ground on this, they can't find common ground on anything.
I think, we're heading back to Washington on Monday. There is a disagreement among both parties, but I think there will be consensus on extending the payroll tax cut this year, particularly where the economy is. We don't want to put a further burden on taxpayers and certainly the middle class right now by having their taxes go up. We need to make sure that we protect Social Security. So this can't be a permanent tax cut extension, but this year it makes sense. I think the parties will come together to resolve it. And from my perspective, I want to, and I think I speak for many other of my colleagues, we want to make sure that it's paid for, and it shouldn't be paid for by further tax increases on those we want to go out and create jobs. We can pay for it through spending cuts. And so I am hopeful that's how it will go forward, but I think it will get resolved.
How accurate is the perception of the gridlock in Washington? Because you talk about where, there is a bipartisan agreement on the payroll tax cuts that needs to happen, but getting there,
there's always disagreements on how you get there. I do think it will get resolved. Listen, the U.S. Senate right now, we've taken the fewest number of votes in years, a decade in the U.S. Senate, because so much of Harry Reid's goal is to not put his members on record on issues. I don't think that's how the Senate should operate. It's been 950 days since we've had a budget for our country. I serve on the Senate Budget Committee, and the Senate has not put together a fiscally responsible budget for our country, and that's because, unfortunately, again, the Democrat-controlled Senate, led by Harry Reid, has said that would be foolish, because when you have to put together a budget, you have to make the hard choices on how to prioritize spending. These are the things that we need to do to move forward. There's been gridlock on these issues, but I'm hopeful that that will end, because the American people want fiscal responsibility. I mean, can you imagine operating our government without a budget? You would never operate a business that way. At home, we have to have a budget. This is something that I'm going to continue to push for. And in fact, I've introduced bipartisan legislation to say you can't work on anything else in the U.S. Senate, can't pass anything else until you pass a budget.
Folks here in New Hampshire have to be wondering, I mean, is your head just swimming? A couple of years ago, I mean, we alluded to it a minute ago, you were putting bad guys in jail.
You're right.
But now you're on the Senate Budget Committee, Senate Armed Services Committee, and the information must be coming at you fast and furious. And all that information is also tied to someone that, I hate to use the word agenda because it's a negative connotation, but right. There's goals attached to that. How difficult is it to navigate it and cut through, what the real answers are, the real numbers are before you make your decision?
Well, one thing, when I was Attorney General and when I was a prosecutor, I always did my homework. So I do a lot of reading, a lot of research, and I talk and get a number of viewpoints before I make a decision. But it comes down to some common sense principles. I think that's what we need most in Washington. Let's live within our means. Let's make sure that we fulfill the fundamental purpose of our government, make sure that people are protected. So for me, it does come down to some common sense principles and bringing that New Hampshire common sense, as you know, that I ran on to Washington. But I do a lot of homework.
I can't let you go without bringing up the aforementioned super committee, and obviously that thing just was a disaster by most accounts. Going into that, though, there was some hope. I mean, how is it that 12 people, smart people, can't get into a room and figure out some of these cuts that are necessary to move things forward, at least reach some sort of compromise where some progress is shown to be made rather than Congress once again blows it?
Right. Well, that was just unacceptable. As you know, Josh, I voted against that debt ceiling agreement because I thought it was insufficient on its face. It didn't deal with our fiscal crisis and the underlying problems. And I think it's irresponsible to actually delegate what is the job of every member of the Senate, every member of the House, to come up with a responsible fiscal blueprint for our country. So the notion of a super committee, to me, wasn't the right way to go. And then I also supported efforts to televise the efforts of the super committee. So much of it was done in secret, and I think the American people, we're all tired of all these secret negotiations in Washington. Never leads to a good result because common sense taxpayers don't get to weigh in on what their elected representatives are doing. But we've got to get our fiscal house in order. Look what's happening in Europe. This is got to be the priority. That's why also the upcoming presidential election is so key in 2012, because this president has not led on, in fact, the debt has increased so dramatically under this president. We're now at $15 trillion in debt. We can't continue on this path.